Hello and welcome back to another It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club. And today we have a great book to discuss. It is The Eighth Sister by Robert Dugoni. It is a wonderful, wonderful read.
It's the first in his Charles Jenkins mystery series.
And it's not really a typical mystery. It's more of a thriller. It is an excellent read.
A pulse-pounding thriller of espionage, spy games, and treachery by the New York Times best-selling author of the Tracy Crosswhite series, former CIA case officer Charles Jenkins is a man at the crossroads. In his early 60s, he has a family, a new baby on the way, and a security consulting business on the brink of bankruptcy. Then his former bureau chief shows up at his house with a risky new assignment. Travel undercover to Moscow and locate a Russian agent believed to be killing members of the clandestine U.S. spy cell known as the Seventh Sisters. Desperate for money, Jenkins agrees to the mission and heads to Russia's capital. But when he finds the mastermind agent behind the assassination, the so-called Eighth Sister, she is not who or what he is led to believe. Then again, neither is anyone else in this deadly game of cat and mouse.
We would like to welcome Robert Dugoni, who is the author of the fascinating book, The Eighth Sister. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
We'll get right into the questions. Is the Seven Sisters spy cell portrayed in The Eighth Sister based in fact? We read that it was loosely based on actual events of a CIA operative accused of treason.
The genesis of the novel came as a result of a conversation that I reluctantly had with an individual. I rarely, if ever, will accept an invitation to talk to anyone about an idea they had for a book. In this particular case, the gentleman had just emailed me to say that he really enjoyed my writing, thought he had a subject for a good story, and I didn't respond. He emailed like the next day and said he'd read the second book in the David Sloane series, and he had this idea for a great story, and I declined. And this went on. I mean, he was reading books faster than I could answer email. And it was crazy. And so finally, I looked him up. I Googled him. I looked him up. And he was a very legitimate businessman here in close by my hometown. And I decided, well, what can it hurt? So I met him for coffee. And the short of a long story is it turns out that he was a former CIA officer who was acquitted of espionage. I think the only CIA officer acquitted by a jury of espionage. That was a really interesting story, but it wasn't a sexy story. It was a dated story. It was a dated country. It was a dated incident. And I said, you've given me something to think about with respect to Charles Jenkins, who is a former CIA officer. If you'd be willing to help me with the spycraft, I think I could craft a pretty good story of sending Jenkins back into Russia. And he said that he would. The trial for espionage, there was no transcripts or anything that I could get my hands on, which was probably a good thing. Although the strategy and the theory and the attorney arguments are based very loosely in reality, based upon some of the things that he did maintain, newspaper articles, really, no transcripts or anything like that. And it's funny because I've gotten just absolutely tremendous reviews on the book. I've gotten tremendous Amazon reader reviews on the book, but I've gotten a couple that were really funny and said things like, well, the first half of the book is totally believable. That trial would never have happened. The trial is really the only thing that's close to the truth. It's not. It's not his trial. It's not his case. It's not what happened to him. He sort of inspired me to bring back Charles Jenkins. And I was glad to do it because I think as a writer, I know for myself, I'm always looking for challenges, whether that challenge is to start a new series, create a new character, try a different form of writing. And so it was good for me. It helped stretch me as a writer.
Now, will the story of Charles Jenkins continue, or is this a one-off book?
I'm already 380 pages into the next book.
Good.
Yeah, I have a Tracy Crosswhite 7, I believe, 7 or 8, coming out next February. And then I am in the process of, this book, I got another 50 or so pages to get to the end, and then we'll begin that process. when I wrote the book, I had an inkling that it could be a series. I didn't really write it with that intent in mind. I had probably 2 or 3 people that helped me with the spycraft. All 3 of them said the exact same thing, which was, well, you're going to write another book, right? And I said, oh, why do you say that? And they told me their reasons, and all of their reasons were the exact same. So I thought, okay. So I actually have thought of ideas for the second book, which I'm finishing, and then a third book. Really, the tricky part about this series will be finding a good enough reason for Charles Jenkins to get back into that life in any extent, because he's a married man, he has a wife, he's got 2 young children. The motivation is going to have to be something much more than just money or career advancement. It's going to have to be something personal. The second book was actually relatively easy. The third book might be a little bit more of a challenge. And that's sort of the struggle that I think all of us writers go through. We want our books to be credible, and credibility really starts at the very beginning, which is the motivation. What's the motivation of your protagonist? Why is your protagonist doing what you're asking him or her to do? Because you're not going to write a book about an ordinary person doing an ordinary thing. You're going to write a book about an ordinary person thrown in extraordinary circumstances, or an ordinary person willingly doing something extraordinary. But you can't do that unless there's a strong motivation, whether it's their career, they're a police detective like Tracy Crosswhite, or it's their job like David Sloane is a lawyer and he takes on the next case. But when you have someone like Charles Jenkins, who is not a career CIA agent, who's not a paid assassin or anything like that, you have to really work hard on the motivation.
And you forgot about the fact that he's in his mid-60s, too.
And, it's really interesting because now that I'm 58 years old, mid-60s doesn't seem that old to me, to be quite honest. I've been through a little bit of the wrecking ball like most people. I ruptured my Achilles. I just had my left hip replaced 2 weeks ago. But I have to tell you, I have a lot of friends that are 60, except for the aches and pains and those kind of things. They're certainly very capable. Charles Jenkins is different. He's not Jack Reacher. He's not James Bond. He's not Jason Bourne. He's a big man. He's a strong man. He can physically handle himself. But because of what happened to him in his past, he doesn't want to kill anyone. He doesn't want to start shooting people. He's not that kind of guy. So he's a guy that's going to have to really work more using his brain. And we'll see what happens. It's been very interesting. I've had a lot of talks this past week with Los Angeles, and that was one of the things that came up. Would you be willing to make him 45 as opposed to 60 or 55 or 50 even? Because there's a lot of African-American actors in that age range and far fewer in the 65 and above age range. It'll be very interesting. I don't really think it's going to become an issue or a problem, but it is something to consider.
I have to tell you, you are talking to 3 women who you took us out of our comfort zone on this book. We don't normally read this type of book, but we all loved it. I read it in 3 days. I could not put it down. And I loved all the characters. I loved your protagonist and your antagonist. He was such a formidable foe. How did you come up with such a interesting antagonist?
I think after 25 years of writing sort of full-time, studying, learning, teaching, I think hopefully you learn stuff. You learn things. I look at my novels now and I think they have progressed beyond my initial novels started out as. 2 things really. One is I think you learn that really the scariest antagonists are the ones that people can relate to. Unless you're writing about a serial killer, someone who's literally psychotic, that's only about 4 to 6% of the population. They exist out there. They're not the everyday people out there. And so what I wanted 2 people that were trying to do their job. Viktor Fedorov is trying to do his job. They have mutual respect for one another's abilities and skills, but that doesn't take away from the fact that they have to do their job. There's a really famous scene in the movie The Fugitive with Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones. Harrison Ford has been wrongly accused. He's a prisoner. He's on a train and he's being taken to the next place and the train derails and crashes and he escapes. Tommy Lee Jones' job is to bring him in. Tommy Lee Jones gets to the train. You can tell he's highly skilled, highly professional, really, really sharp. And this is going to be a real intellectual battle. And there's a scene where Harrison Ford gets to a dam and the water is pouring out of the dam and Tommy Lee Jones has cornered him. And the only hope that Harrison Ford has is to jump. And so he turns around and he looks at Tommy Lee Jones and he says, I didn't kill my wife. And Tommy Lee Jones in the script was supposed to have about a paragraph of things he was supposed to say, but he forgot his lines. And so he looks at Harrison Ford and he says, I don't care. And that was it. And the director realized it was brilliant because that's really what it was about. Is he didn't care. His job was to bring him in. Whether he was innocent or not innocent went completely beyond that. I always found that fascinating for a lot of reasons. I always found it sort of more believable, more credible. The other reason is I just have reached a point in my life where I don't want to write those kind of books. I don't want to immerse myself in that kind of dark world. It's not something I want to do. I won't write kids in peril books. I don't want to write stories of women being tortured and raped. I don't want to go there. And I have been blessed to be able to, I think, craft plots that a lot of people find fun to read, not that creepy horror type stuff.
I think in the acknowledgments, you mentioned that Charlie Jenkins is named after a college friend of yours.
He is.
But is the character based on that college friend, or is he a complete fictional?
Charlie in law school was my roommate. And he was 6'5" and he was about 230 pounds. I used to joke with him. I used to say women used to cross the street to get in front of Charlie, and men used to cross the street to get away from him. He could be very intimidating, but he was really a teddy bear. And he's a wonderful man, wonderful person, wonderful dad. I had told him years ago, I said, in law school, when I had told him that what I really wanted to do was write books, I called him Chaz. And I used to say, someday I'm going to make you famous, Chaz. And he'd laugh and smile and say, yeah, okay, Bubba. When I wrote The Jurymaster, he was one of the guys that I had a place for in that novel. And I put him in. And I never in my wildest imaginations thought that he would be coming back with a series of his own. So his physical likeness, his physical appearance is very much like Charlie and his name. And I asked him and I told him I would never embarrass him. And he agreed. But Charlie is an attorney. He's never been in the CIA. As far as I know, never been in the CIA.
What does Charlie think of your fictional character, Charlie?
Oh, he thinks it's a hoot. He said he just thinks it's hysterical. I always send him a signed copy of the book. You know, he's got 2 kids now that kind of appreciate it and laugh at it. People will call him and say, hey, I've been reading this book by this guy, and yeah, that's me. He was in court one time, told me that the judge read my book. And the judge said to him, he was talking, he got done with the argument, and the judge said to him, Mr. Jenkins, he said, yes, Your Honor. And he said, say hello to David Sloane for me.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. He has some fun with it. Again, I can't emphasize enough. He's a really good man. He's just a really good man, and he was a really close friend who opted to stay and live in Los Angeles. And so, unfortunately, I don't get to see him as often as I would have liked.
Now, are the David Sloane books coming to an end since you switched gears?
One of the difficulties with the David Sloane books, they are owned by a number of different arenas. The Jurymaster is a Hachette novel. Simon & Schuster has 2 novels, and I own the rights now for reasons I don't want to discuss, but I own the rights now to 2 of the novels. And so creating a David Sloane, and I've been asked that quite a bit by people, but going back to the David Sloane characters would be difficult for a lot of reasons. You know, politically, there's a lot of issues to navigate. TV series, movie-wise, there's a lot of issues to navigate. There's just a lot of different things to consider and think about. When I talked to my current publisher, Thomas & Mercer, about wanting to do another series, that was one of the things they said to me was, would it be a Charles Jenkins book or would it be a David Sloane book? And I said it would be a Charles Jenkins book. That was important to them for a lot of reasons, that as you stay in this business long enough, you begin to realize that there's an art to it and there's a business side to it. And you really need to be able to navigate both.
You describe a family vacation to Russia in 1998 with scenes that sound like they came directly from the pages of a Russian spy novel. How did these memories affect the writing in The Eighth Sister?
Very closely, actually. So I had my own feelings about Russia for having been there for 3 weeks and all the things that happened to me, which I'll talk about in a second. But I also knew that I needed to talk to some people that had really lived there. I was able to get a hold of several people that lived and worked in Russia for years. And one of them turned out to be a CIA undercover officer. And then there were 2 others. What I was really interested in is whether or not my experience with the people was the same as their experience and their much more sophisticated education of the Russian people. It was not my intent to offend the Russian people. I found the Russian people, when I visited there, to be very guarded and very closed until you engaged them. Once you engage them, They were very warm and generous people. But one of the difficulties of traveling in Russia is not only the language barrier, there's an alphabet barrier. I mean, they use the Cyrillic alphabet. When you travel to Italy or Spain and someone tells you to go to Florence, you look it up and there's the word Florence. You try to do that in Russia and you can't read it. You can't read the signs or anything. And so there were many occasions where we would need help getting to where we were going.